You can't fix that. That's what Tyler Briggs said to the 78-year-old man standing in his gun shop on a Tuesday morning in October. Didn't ask his name, didn't look twice at the rifle case under his arm, just glanced at the grey hair, the worn canvas jacket, the dust on his boots, and decided the conversation was over. That thing belongs in a museum, old-timer. We don't do charity restorations. The old man didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just set the rifle case on the counter and looked at Tyler with a stillness that most people spend their whole lives trying to learn. And what happened next, what happened in the 48 hours that followed, would become the single most humbling moment of Tyler Briggs's career. If this story moves you, type craftsman in the comments. Because this man earned that word with his hands. His name was Earl Hadley, and he lived alone in a house he'd built himself 41 years ago on 7 acres outside of Harlan, Kentucky. It was a small house, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove he still used every morning, and a workshop out back that was bigger than the house itself. The workshop was the thing. If you drove past Earl's property, you might not even notice the house, but you couldn't miss the workshop. A long steel-sided building with a copper weather vane on the roof shaped like a rifle barrel. The patina turned green decades ago. Inside that workshop, every tool hung in its place on pegboard walls that hadn't been rearranged since 1983. Lathes, milling machines, a forge he'd built from fire brick and angle iron, on barrels of walnut and maple blanks seasoned for years, racks of hand-ground chisels and files so precisely shaped that each one fit only the curve it was made for. The air smelled like linseed oil and iron filings and the faint sweetness of walnut dust, a smell that had seeped into the concrete floor and the steel walls and even the insulation in the ceiling, so deep that you could close every window and door and the building would still smell like a gunsmith shop 50 years from now. Earl Hadley had been a gunsmith for 62 years. He'd started at 16, apprenticing under his father, who'd apprenticed under his. 3 generations of Hadley men had shaped metal and wood into firearms that people drove hundreds of miles to own. Earl's hands were the map of that legacy. Thick knuckles swollen at the joints, the pad of his right index finger flattened from decades of pressing against trigger guards during test fires, a pale scar across the back of his left hand where a barrel blank had kicked loose from a lathe in 1974. He walked with a slight forward lean, the posture of a man who'd spent more of his life bent over a workbench than standing upright. His eyes were still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, and when he looked at a piece of metal, he didn't just see what it was, he saw what it could become, but none of that was visible to the young men behind the counter at Ridgeline Firearms and Custom Works. All they saw was an old man with a beat-up rifle case and dirt on his boots, and that was exactly the mistake that would come back to haunt every single one of them. Because 300 miles south, in a glass-walled office overlooking the Cumberland River, a man named Raymond Cross had just received a phone call that would put him in his truck within the hour. Ridgeline Firearms sat on a commercial strip outside of Lexington, sandwiched between an auto parts store and a vape shop. It was a new business, 18 months old, with a freshly painted facade, LED signage, and a showroom designed to look like something out of a catalogue. Glass display cases held rows of modern rifles and handguns arranged by price point, the most expensive models backlit like jewellery. Behind the counter, a long workbench stretched the length of the back wall, visible through a half window that let customers watch the gunsmiths work. It was a smart setup, designed to signal competence and transparency. The shop smelled like hop solvent and new carpet, and the Bluetooth speaker behind the register played country music at a volume just low enough to seem professional. There was a coffee machine in the corner, a rack of branded t-shirts by the door, and a chalkboard wall where Tyler wrote the week's specials in careful block letters. It was, by every modern measure, a successful small business. Their Yelp reviews averaged 4.7 stars. Their Instagram had 9,000 followers. They had done everything right according to every metric that could be measured on a screen. The 3 young men who ran the shop, Tyler Briggs, Marcus Doane, and a quiet kid named Caleb Rowe, had all graduated from the same trade program at a technical college in Tennessee. Tyler was the oldest at 27 and considered himself the leader. He had a neatly trimmed beard, a company polo with his name embroidered on the chest, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing just enough to think you know everything. Marcus was 25, heavy-set, with a loud laugh and a habit of narrating his work for the Instagram videos Tyler had him post 3 times a week. Caleb was 23 and mostly kept his head down, running the CNC machine in the corner and staying out of conversations that didn't involve him. They were good at what they did, competent, efficient, trained on modern platforms and digital tooling. They could build an AR pattern rifle from a parts kit in under an hour. They could bore sight a scope with a laser system and have a customer on the range by lunch. What they couldn't do, what none of them had ever been asked to do, was take a piece of damaged steel and broken wood and bring it back to life with nothing but hand tools and 60 years of knowledge. And they were about to find out just how much that gap would cost them, because the man they'd just dismissed wasn't the kind of man who stayed dismissed for long. Earl had driven 2 hours to get to Ridgeline Firearms. He'd heard about the shop from a woman at church whose grandson worked there, Caleb, the quiet one. And she'd spoken highly of the young men, said they were doing good work, building something. Earl liked that. He'd spent his whole life building things, and he respected anyone who picked up a tool with the intention of making something better than it was before. The rifle he carried wasn't junk. It was a Winchester Model 70, manufactured in 1962. Pre-64, the configuration collectors called the Rifleman's Rifle. This particular one had belonged to Earl's father, and before that to a man named Dalton Hadley, Earl's grandfather, who had carried it through the mountains of eastern Kentucky for 30 autumns. The stock had a crack running along the wrist, not catastrophic, but deep enough to affect the bedding. The bluing on the barrel had worn to a dull grey in patches, and the bolt handle showed surface rust where moisture had crept under a leather case during a basement flood 6 years earlier. It was, by any honest assessment, a rifle that needed work. But it was also a rifle with provenance, with history, with the kind of soul that only comes from being carried by hands that loved it. And Earl hadn't brought it to Ridgeline because he couldn't fix it himself. He could. He'd restored hundreds of firearms more damaged than this one. He'd brought it because he was 78 years old, and his workshop, the one with the copper weather vane and the pegboard walls, just was getting quieter every year. His hands still worked, his eyes still measured true, but he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with his body. He was tired of being the last one, the last Hadley gunsmith. The last man in the county who could file a barrel octagon by hand. The last person alive who knew the specific recipe his grandfather had used for case-hardening colour. He wanted to pass it down. He wanted to walk into a shop full of young men and see if any of them had the patience, the eye, the reverence for the craft that would make them worth teaching. That was the real reason he'd driven 2 hours with a rifle he could have fixed in his own workshop. He wasn't looking for a repair. He was looking for an heir. Tyler had already turned back to his computer when Earl set the rifle case on the counter and unzipped it. The smell hit first, old leather, gun oil, and something deeper, the faint sweetness of aged walnut. Marcus glanced over from his workbench and raised an eyebrow. "What have we got?" Tyler said without looking up. "Winchester Model 70, Earl said. His voice was quiet, steady, the kind of voice that doesn't waste syllables. Pre-64, stock needs regluing and refinishing. Barrel needs reblued. Bolt handles got surface corrosion." Tyler finally looked. He leaned over the counter, glanced at the rifle the way a mechanic glances at a car with a dented fender, and shook his head. "Yeah, I can see that. Look, sir, we don't really do this kind of work. We're a modern shop, Cerakote, new builds, optics installation. This is..." He waved his hand vaguely. "This is restoration work. You'd need to find somebody who specializes in older stuff." "I know what it needs," Earl said. "I'm asking if you can do it." Tyler straightened up and crossed his arms. "I'm telling you, we can't. Honestly, I wouldn't even know where to start with rebluing a barrel that old. The steel's different. The tolerances are different. It's a whole different animal." Marcus had walked over by now, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He looked at the rifle and let out a low whistle, though whether it was appreciation or pity was hard to tell. "Man. That thing's seen some miles," he said. "Is that rust on the bolt?" "Surface corrosion," Earl said again patiently. "It's not structural. A proper acid bath and cold blue would bring it back." Marcus and Tyler exchanged a look, the kind of look young men give each other when they think an old man is being unreasonable. "Sir," Tyler said, leaning on the word in a way that made it sound less like respect and more like a traffic cone placed at the edge of his patience. "We appreciate you coming in, but this isn't something we can take on. You might try posting it online, see if there's a collector who wants it as is." Earl looked at Tyler for a long moment. Then he looked at Marcus. Then he looked past them both to the workbench behind the half window, where Caleb Rowe sat on a stool running a bore brush through a modern rifle barrel. Not looking up, not meeting anyone's eyes. Earl zipped the case closed. He picked it up, and for a moment it seemed like he would simply walk out. Tyler had already started to turn back to his screen, but Earl didn't walk out. He walked to the side of the counter, set the case down on the customer bench near the window, and reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket. What he pulled out was a tool roll, not the nylon kind sold at hardware stores, but a leather roll, hand-stitched, dark with age, the kind of thing that exists only because someone made it by hand for a specific purpose decades ago. Tyler thought this was the end of the conversation. He thought the old man would pack up, maybe grumble a little and drive home. He was wrong. This was the beginning of the worst afternoon of Tyler Briggs's professional life. Earl unrolled the leather tool roll on the customer bench with the practiced motion of a surgeon laying out instruments. Inside were 32 hand tools, each one seated in its own stitched pocket. Screwdrivers with wooden handles turned on a lathe, pin punches ground to exact diameters, a set of needle files so fine they looked like they belonged in a jeweller's workshop, a small brass hammer with a face polish to a mirror finish. Every tool was immaculate. Every tool was older than every person in the room. Tyler turned around when he heard the soft clink of metal on leather. Marcus stopped wiping his hands. Even Caleb looked up from his bore brush. Earl didn't say a word. He unzipped the rifle case, lifted the Winchester out with both hands, one on the forestock, one cradling the receiver, and set it on the bench. And then he selected a screwdriver from the roll, fitted it to the first guard screw and began to disassemble the rifle. His hands moved with a precision that was almost unsettling. There was no hesitation, no double-checking, no pausing to examine the next step. He knew this rifle the way a pianist knows a concerto, not from thinking, but from the deep body memory that comes from doing something 10,000 times. The guard screws came out. The trigger guard dropped free. He lifted the barreled action out of the stock and set it down, then turned the stock over in his hands, running his thumb along the crack in the wrist. His thumbnail found the deepest point of the split and he nodded to himself. A tiny motion, the way a doctor nods when a diagnosis is confirmed. She cracked along the grain, he murmured. And it wasn't clear if he was talking to anyone or just to the wood. Not a break. A separation. That means the fibres are still married. You heat the glue, clamp it right, and she'll hold another 50 years. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. Tyler stood behind the counter, arms still crossed, watching. Something had shifted in the room. Something in the air, in the quality of the silence. It was the silence that falls in a concert hall when the first note rings out, and the audience realizes they're hearing something extraordinary. Caleb had set down his bore brush, and was watching Earl's hands with an expression that was hard to read. Somewhere between fascination and recognition, as if he were seeing something he'd always suspected existed but had never witnessed in person. Earl worked steadily, methodically, dislaying each component in a specific position on the bench as he went. The bolt came free with a half-turn and a pull. He held it up to the light from the window, turning it slowly, examining the corrosion with the same careful attention a jeweller would give a stone. This bolt was hand-fitted, he said quietly. 1962, pre-push feed. See how the locking lugs sit? That's not a machine cut. Somebody dressed those by hand. Nobody responded, because nobody in the room, not Tyler, not Marcus, not even Caleb, had ever seen a hand-fitted bolt lug before. They didn't know what they were looking at, but they knew, with the instinctive recognition that even arrogance can't fully suppress, that they were watching someone who operated on a level they hadn't known existed. And across the room, on the back wall behind the register, near a framed photograph hung in a row of industry portraits, it showed a younger version of a man named Raymond Cross, founder of Cross Custom Arms, one of the most prestigious rifle makers in the American South, shaking hands with another man at an industry banquet in 1991. The other man in the photograph was younger then, his hair dark, his back straight, but the hands were the same, the scar on the left hand was the same. The quiet, steady focus in the eyes was exactly the same. That photograph had hung on that wall since the shop opened. Tyler walked past it every single day, and he had never once looked closely enough to recognize the man in it. The man who was now sitting 6 feet away, fixing the rifle Tyler had said couldn't be fixed. Earl worked for the rest of the morning. Nobody asked him to leave, nobody told him to stop. At some point the dynamic had simply shifted, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, undeniable authority of competence. Tyler retreated to his computer. Marcus busied himself with a customer order, but Caleb, Caleb Rowe, the 23-year-old who rarely spoke and kept his head down, pulled a stool over to the customer bench and sat 3 feet from Earl watching. He didn't ask questions at first. He just watched the way Earl's hands moved, the way he selected each tool without looking, the way he held the stock at a specific angle to let the overhead light reveal the grain direction. It was the watching of someone who recognized mastery without needing it explained. Earl noticed. He didn't acknowledge it directly, but he adjusted, slightly, almost imperceptibly, the angle at which he worked, turning his hands just enough that Caleb could see what he was doing more clearly. It was a gesture so small that no one else in the room caught it. But it was the first real thing that had happened in that shop all morning. Around noon, Earl set his tools down and walked outside. He sat on the tailgate of his truck, a 1998 Ford F-150 with 240,000 miles on it, the bed scarred with the ghosts of lumber and pipe and rifle cases, and ate a sandwich he'd packed that morning, ham on white bread, a thermos of black coffee. He ate slowly, looking at the parking lot, at the auto parts store next door, at the thin October sky above the strip mall. He thought about his father, about the way his father had taught him, not with lectures or manuals, but by simply doing the work and letting Earl stand close enough to absorb it. His father had never said watch this or pay attention. He'd just worked, and the knowledge had passed between them like heat from a stove, steady and wordless and permanent. The way soil absorbs rain, not all at once but over years, until one day the roots go deep enough that you can't tell where the teaching stops and the knowing begins. Earl had hoped to find that here. He'd hoped to walk in, present the rifle, and see a young man's eyes light up the way his own had at 16, that particular hunger that says I want to know how. Tyler and Marcus hadn't shown it. They'd looked at the rifle and seen a problem, an inconvenience, something that didn't fit their workflow. But the boy in the corner, the quiet one with his grandmother's church, that boy had pulled up a stool. He hadn't asked to, hadn't been invited. He'd simply moved closer, the way iron moves toward a magnet, because something in him recognized something in what Earl was doing, even if he couldn't name it yet. And Earl Hadley, who had forgotten more about firearms than most men would ever learn, allowed himself for the first time in years to feel something that might have been hope. It was a small feeling, and fragile, like the first green shoot in a field that's been fallow too long, but it was there. And what Earl didn't know, what he had no way of knowing as he sat on that tailgate eating his sandwich, was that while he'd been working, Caleb Rowe had taken a photograph, not of the rifle, of Earl's hands, and he had sent it, without a caption, to the one person he thought might understand what he was looking at. Earl came back inside at 12:30 and resumed the work. The stock was clamped now, the crack sealed with a thin bead of hide glue that Earl had mixed himself from granules he carried in a small glass jar in his jacket pocket. Hide glue! Not epoxy, not polyurethane, not any of the modern adhesives that lined the shelf behind Tyler's workbench. Hide glue, the same animal protein adhesive that luthiers had used on violins for 300 years, the same glue Earl's grandfather had used, the same glue that could be reversed with steam if the joint ever needed to be opened again. Tyler had come around the counter at one point and stood watching, his arms crossed. His expression caught between irritation and something he didn't want to admit was curiosity. "You know," Tyler said, trying for casual, "we've got a Kragler's on the shelf. It'd set in 2 hours and hold like concrete." Earl didn't look up. "Concrete doesn't belong in a rifle stock," he said. Tyler's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, reconsidered, and walked back behind the counter. At the workbench, Marcus was pretending to work on a Cerakote job, but his eyes kept drifting to the old man at the customer bench. There was something about the way Earl worked that made everything else in the shop feel rushed, provisional, temporary. The CNC machine in the corner suddenly looked less like a tool and more like a shortcut. The bottles of modern finish on the shelves suddenly looked less like innovation and more like impatience. It was an uncomfortable feeling, and Marcus didn't like it. He didn't like the way the old man made him feel. Not angry exactly, but exposed, as though something he'd been taught was competence had just been quietly revealed as something less. The afternoon light shifted through the front window, catching the dust motes that drifted up from Earl's work, and the shop took on a quality it hadn't had before, a stillness, a weight, as though the room itself was paying attention to what was happening at that bench. By mid-afternoon, Earl had the stock glued and clamped, the bolt disassembled and soaking in a mild acid solution. He'd mixed from a bottle of phosphoric acid he'd also brought with him, and the barreled action stripped down to bare metal on the bench. He was dressing the receiver with a fine-cut file, removing tool marks that were older than his own marriage, when the front door opened and a man walked in. He was mid-50s, maybe 60, wearing a canvas field jacket over a chambray shirt, with silver-streaked hair combed straight back, and the kind of face that had been weathered by something more specific than age. He carried himself like someone accustomed to being recognised. Tyler straightened up behind the counter. "Can I help you, sir?" The man didn't answer Tyler. He was looking at the customer bench. He was looking at the leather tool roll. He was looking at the hands. "Earl," he said. And the way he said that name, quiet, certain, the single syllable carrying the weight of decades, changed everything in the room. Earl looked up. His hands stopped moving for the first time all day. His eyes found the man's face. And something passed between them that had nothing to do with anyone else in that shop, a recognition that went deeper than names, deeper than memory, all the way down to the bedrock of shared work and shared time. "Raymond," Earl said, and he almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Raymond Cross had not set foot in a strip mall gun shop in 15 years. His company, Cross Custom Arms, built rifles that started at $8,000 and went up from there, rifles carried by competition shooters and collected by people whose names appeared in financial magazines. He had a facility outside of Nashville with 22 employees, a waiting list that ran 14 months, and a reputation built on a single, unassailable fact. Every rifle that left his shop was perfect. Not good, not excellent, perfect. And every single technique, every standard, every uncompromising habit that had built that reputation, he had learned from Earl Hadley. He'd shown up at Earl's workshop in 1989, a 22-year-old with a community college certificate and a box of cheap tools asking for a job. Earl hadn't hired him. Earl didn't hire people. But he'd let Raymond stand in the corner and watch, the same way his own father had let him stand and watch. And over the course of 3 years, Raymond Cross had absorbed everything Earl Hadley knew about metal and wood and the space between them. When Raymond left to start his own shop in 1992, Earl had given him one thing, a hand-forged scraper, ground from an old file with a walnut handle Earl had turned himself. Raymond still had it. It sat in a glass case in the lobby of Cross Custom Arms, next to a brass plate that read, "From the hands of Earl Hadley, the Standard." Raymond had received Caleb's photograph 45 minutes ago. He hadn't called ahead. He hadn't texted back. He had simply gotten in his truck and driven. Because the photograph hadn't just shown an old man's hands working on a rifle. It had shown Earl Hadley's hands. Hands he would have recognized in any photograph, in any light, from any angle. Working on a rifle in a shop where, based on what the kid's brief follow-up text had described, the other gunsmiths hadn't recognized him, hadn't known who he was, had turned him away. Raymond Cross had built an empire on patience and precision. He did not lose his temper. He did not raise his voice. But as he stood in the doorway of Ridgeline Firearms, looking at Earl Hadley sitting on a bench with his leather tool roll and his grandfather's Winchester, Raymond felt something tighten in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't anger exactly. It was grief. Grief for the state of a craft he loved. Grief that the man who had taught him everything was sitting in a shop where nobody knew his name. And under the grief, something harder and more deliberate, the absolute certainty that every person in this room was about to learn something they would never forget. Raymond walked past the counter without stopping. Tyler started to say something. "Sir, can I?" But the words died in his throat when Raymond's hand came up, a single flat gesture that said "not now" with the efficiency of a traffic signal. Raymond pulled a stool next to Earl's bench and sat down. No, for a long moment neither man spoke. Raymond looked at the rifle on the bench, at the components laid out in their precise order, at the stock clamped with hide glue and cotton cord in a pattern he recognized instantly, because Earl had taught him that pattern 34 years ago. "That's the 70-06 Dalton carried," Raymond said quietly. It wasn't a question. "It is," Earl said. "Stock separated along the grain, about 6 inches. Did you steam it open first?" Didn't need to, she split clean. The grain was still married. Raymond nodded. He picked up the bolt body from the bench, carefully, the way you pick up something that belongs to someone else's history, and held it to the light the same way Earl had hours before. Hand-fitted lugs, he said. Beautiful. My father did that bolt, Earl said. 1962. I was 16. He let me watch. The room was absolutely silent. Tyler stood behind the counter, his face cycling through expressions like a man trying to find a radio station. Confusion, then recognition of the name Raymond Cross, then the slow, dawning understanding that the old man he'd turned away was somehow connected to one of the most respected names in the American firearms industry. Marcus had stopped pretending to work. He was standing still, holding a spray bottle of Cerakote solvent, staring at the two men at the bench with the expression of someone who has just realized the ground isn't where they thought it was. Tyler, Raymond said, without turning around. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. That photograph on your back wall, third from the left. Tyler looked. The framed photo from 1991. Two men shaking hands. You know who that is? Raymond asked. That's you, Tyler said. Right. And the man I'm shaking hands with? Silence. That's Earl Hadley, Raymond said. The man you told couldn't get his rifle fixed. The man you said should post it online. He turned on his stool and looked at Tyler directly for the first time. Earl Hadley has been building rifles since before your parents were born. He taught me everything I know. He taught a generation of gunsmiths who taught the generation after that. The technique I use for bedding, that's Earl's. The way I finish a stock, Earl's. The standard that every rifle leaves my shop measured against, that's Earl Hadley's standard. Tyler's face had gone white, not red, white. The blood had simply left. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked at Earl, who was sitting quietly on his stool, one hand resting on the edge of the bench, watching this unfold with the same patient, steady expression he'd worn all morning. I didn't, Tyler started. I know you didn't, Raymond said. That's the problem. The next few minutes unfolded with the specific, uncomfortable gravity of a lesson being learned in real time. Raymond didn't yell, he didn't lecture, he did something worse. He simply told the truth, in a quiet voice, with the measured precision of a man who had spent 30 years choosing his words the way he chose his tolerances. He told them that Earl Hadley had hand-built over 4,000 rifles in his career, that his work was in the collections of 3 museums, that 3 of his rifles had been used by United States military marksmen in competition, and one of them still held a record at Camp Perry. He told them that Earl had been offered positions by every major firearms manufacturer in the country, and had turned them all down because he believed the craft belonged in small shops, in individual hands, passed from one person to the next the way his father had passed it to him. He told them that Earl had driven 2 hours at 78 years old, not because he needed help, but because he'd heard there were young gunsmiths doing good work, and he wanted to see for himself, wanted to see if any of them had the eye, the patience, the hands, wanted to see if the craft had a future. And what he found, Raymond said, looking at Tyler, then at Marcus, was a shop full of young men who couldn't recognize a pre-64 Model 70 when it was set on their counter, who told a man with 62 years of experience that his rifle wasn't worth their time, and who had a photograph of the greatest living gunsmith hanging on their own wall without knowing who he was. Marcus set the spray bottle down on his workbench. His hand was trembling slightly and he put it in his pocket. Tyler hadn't moved. He was standing behind the counter with his arms at his sides, his embroidered polo suddenly looking less like a professional uniform and more like a costume. Caleb Rowe sat on his stool in the corner, the phone still in his hand, watching everything with dark, quiet eyes. He didn't look surprised. He looked like someone who had suspected something like this might happen. Not the specifics, but the general shape of it, the way you can sometimes feel a storm coming before the sky changes. Earl cleared his throat. "Raymond," he said, "that's enough." Raymond turned to him. "Earl, that's enough," Earl repeated, and his voice carried the particular authority of a man who had spent 6 decades speaking only when he meant it. Raymond closed his mouth. He nodded once, a small, tight motion, and turned back to the bench. The room held still. Earl picked up his file and looked at it for a moment, turning it in his hands. Then he set it down and looked at Tyler. "Son," he said, and the word was neither hostile nor warm. It was simply accurate, a statement of generational fact. I didn't come here to be recognised. I came here because a woman at my church told me her grandson was learning to build rifles, and that made me want to drive up and see. That's all." He paused. "You were wrong about the rifle. It's not junk, and it doesn't belong in a museum. It belongs in the hands of someone who knows what it is. But you were also wrong about something bigger." He tapped the workbench with one knuckle. "You looked at me and decided you already knew everything you needed to know. That's the most dangerous thing a craftsman can do. Not a wrong cut, not a bad measurement. Deciding you already know." Tyler swallowed. "Mr. Hadley, I don't know what to say. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Earl said. "Be curious." He picked up the file again. "Now, do you want to learn how to dress a receiver, or do you want to stand over there looking sick all afternoon?" Tyler came around the counter. He came slowly, the way a man approaches something he's not sure will hold his weight, but he came. He pulled Marcus's stool to the bench and sat down across from Earl, and for the first time since the old man had walked through the door, Tyler Briggs looked at him, really looked at him, saw the scar on the left hand, saw the flattened fingertip, saw the way Earl held the file, not gripped in his fist the way they'd been taught in school, but cradled along the heel of his palm, 3 fingers guiding, the pressure coming from the shoulder, not the wrist. "We were taught to use the vice and let the machine do the work," Tyler said quietly. "Nothing wrong with that," Earl said. "Machines do good work. But a machine doesn't know what this receiver felt like in 1962, when a man named Walter Hadley ran his thumb across it and decided it was done. A machine doesn't know that this particular rifle went up a mountain in Harlan County every October for 30 years, with a man who could put a bullet through a playing card at 200 yards. A machine finishes a surface. A hand finishes a story." He positioned the file against the receiver flat, angled it precisely, and drew it forward in a single slow stroke. The sound was clean and pure, a whisper of steel on steel. A tiny curl of metal rose from the surface and fell away. "Like that," Earl said. "Try." Tyler took the file. His first stroke was wrong. Too much wrist, not enough shoulder, the angle off by a few degrees. Earl watched, said nothing, and waited. Tyler tried again, still wrong, but closer. Earl adjusted Tyler's grip, a single touch on the back of his hand redirecting the pressure point. And Tyler drew the file again. This time the sound was different, cleaner, truer. Tyler looked up. "How do you know when it's right?" he asked. "You'll hear it," Earl said. "The metal will tell you." Marcus had edged closer. He hadn't been invited, but Earl didn't send him away. Caleb had moved his stool nearer as well, the 3 young gunsmiths now arranged around the old man's bench, like students in a workshop that had just opened without anyone signing a lease. Raymond sat to one side, watching with an expression that shifted between pride and sorrow. Pride in Earl, sorrow for the years that had passed since he'd seen him do this, sorrow for the knowledge that time was the one thing no craftsman could bend to his will. Earl worked through the afternoon, and as he worked he taught. Not in the way they'd been taught in school, not with PowerPoints or certification modules or step-by-step procedural documents. He taught the way his father had taught him, and his grandfather before that. He told stories. While he filed, he talked about a barrel he'd straightened in 1978 using nothing but a mirror, a window, and his own shadow. While he mixed bluing solution, he explained why the old cold blue formulas worked better on vintage steel than any modern hot salt bath, and how his grandfather had once blued a rifle barrel using a solution made from ferric chloride and rainwater collected in a copper basin. While he fitted the bolt back into the receiver, he described the concept of feel, the unmeasurable, unteachable sense of when 2 pieces of metal are married correctly. When the tolerances are right, not because a gauge says so, but because your hands say so. "A gauge will tell you it's within spec," Earl said, sliding the bolt home and working the action. The sound was like a whispered promise, smooth, tight, alive. Your hands will tell you it's right. Those are 2 different things. Spec is the floor, right is the ceiling. Earl came back the next morning. Nobody had asked him to. Nobody had expected him to. But at 7:45, 15 minutes before Ridgeline Firearms opened, his truck pulled into the lot, and the old man got out carrying his leather tool roll and a brown paper bag from a donut shop he'd passed on the highway. He set the donuts on the counter and went to work. The stock was ready to come out of the clamps. He unwound the cotton cord, removed the wooden cauls, and held the stock up to the light. The crack was invisible. Not hidden. Invisible. The grain had married so perfectly under the hide glue that even with the stock turned to catch the morning sun through the front window, there was no line, no shadow, no indication that the wood had ever been anything but whole. Tyler arrived at 8. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Earl already at the bench. For a moment neither man spoke. Then Tyler hung up his jacket, walked to the bench and said, "What do you need me to do?" "Get me some steel wool," Earl said, "triple aught, and a clean rag." Tyler got them. And for the next 6 hours Earl Hadley refinished his grandfather's rifle stock while 3 young gunsmiths watched, helped, asked questions, made mistakes, and slowly, incrementally, learned. Then he showed them how to raise the grain with steam from a damp cloth and a soldering iron. He showed them how to whisker a stock, rubbing it with fine steel wool between coats of oil to cut the raised fibres flush, and why you always cut with the grain, never against and never in circles. He showed them how to build a finish that looked like glass but felt like wood, layer by layer, oil into walnut, each coat rubbed to a whisper-thin sheen, and dried before the next one went on. "This is a 3-day finish," he said, "and I'm doing it in 2 because I've got a doctor's appointment Thursday." He said it without self-pity, without drama, as a simple fact. The kind of fact that makes you suddenly aware that the man in front of you is not permanent, that the hands doing this work exist inside a body that time is slowly calling home. Raymond had come back too. He sat off to the side, drinking coffee from a paper cup, occasionally answering questions from Tyler or Marcus about the business side of custom rifle work. But mostly he watched Earl. He watched the way Earl's right hand cradled the stock while his left hand moved the steel wool in long, even strokes. He watched the patience, the absolute unhurried patience, of a man applying a 4th coat of oil to a surface that most people would have called finished after the 2nd. And at one point when Earl paused to rest his hands, Raymond leaned over and said very quietly, "You were always the best, Earl. You know that." Earl looked at him. "I was always the most stubborn," he said. "That's different." But he almost smiled again, and this time it came a little closer to the surface. By late afternoon on the 2nd day, the Winchester Model 70 was complete. The stock gleamed with a depth that seemed to come from inside the walnut, a warm amber glow that looked less like a finish and more like the wood itself was lit from within. The barrel had been re-blued to a deep, even midnight that caught the overhead fluorescent lights and held them. The bolt slid home with the same whispered precision it had possessed the day Earl's father assembled it in 1962. The rifle looked new. Not modern new, not factory new. New, the way a cathedral looks new after a restoration. Its beauty not invented but recovered. The thing it always was made visible again by someone who knew where to find it. Earl laid the rifle on the bench and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he turned to Caleb Rowe, who had spent 2 days standing closer to Earl than anyone else, who had asked fewer questions but watched more carefully, whose hands had shown the steadiest touch when Earl let him try the file, the steel wool, the oiling cloth. "Son," Earl said, and this time the word was warm. "Your grandmother tells me you're the quiet type." Caleb nodded. "Quiet's good," Earl said. "Quiet means you're listening." He reached into his leather tool roll and pulled out a screwdriver, not the one he'd been using, but a different one, older, its handle darkened almost black from decades of palm oil and use. "This was my father's," he said. "He turned the handle from a piece of Osage orange that grew behind our house. Used it every day for 30 years. He held it out to Caleb. "You've got good hands," he said, "and you've got the right kind of eyes. I can see it. I'd like you to come down to my workshop next Saturday if you're willing. Bring your own tools. I'll show you things they can't teach in a program." Caleb took the screwdriver. He held it the way Earl held things, carefully, with both the weight and the history accounted for in his grip. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'd like that." Tyler was standing behind the counter, watching this exchange with an expression that contained multitudes: shame, gratitude, and something that looked like the beginning of a very long re-evaluation of what he thought he knew. "Mr. Hadley," Tyler said, "I want to apologize again, for yesterday, for what I said." Earl waved one hand, a small dismissive gesture that was also in its way a benediction. "You'll do better," he said. It was a statement, not a question. And the way he said it made Tyler believe it. Marcus cleared his throat. "Sir, Mr. Hadley." Would it be all right if I came too, on Saturday? Earl looked at him. Can you be patient? Marcus paused. It was, Earl suspected, the first time anyone had asked him that question, and expected an honest answer. I can try, Marcus said. Then come, Earl said. Raymond walked Earl to his truck as the afternoon light angled low across the parking lot. The strip mall looked different now, or maybe it didn't look different at all, and the difference was only in the two men who walked across it, carrying between them a history that stretched back further than the asphalt, further than the buildings, all the way back to a workshop in Harlan County with a copper weather vane and pegboard walls. Earl put his tool roll on the passenger seat and the rifle case in the bed of the truck, cushioned by a folded wool blanket he kept there for this purpose. He moved carefully, each motion deliberate, his body acknowledging the 2 days of work the way a building acknowledges a storm, still standing but aware. You didn't have to come, Raymond, Earl said. Yeah, Raymond said. I did. They stood for a moment in the particular silence of men who have known each other long enough that most conversations are unnecessary. A car pulled into the auto parts store next door. A bird sat on the ridge of the vape shop roof, regarding them with professional indifference. Those boys, Earl said, nodding toward the shop. They're not bad, they're just new. They were disrespectful, Raymond said. They were ignorant, Earl corrected. That's different. Ignorance you can fix. Disrespect comes from character. Those boys don't have bad character. They've just never been close enough to real craftsmanship to know what it looks like. He paused. That's not their fault. That's ours. We didn't pass it down fast enough. We let the chain get thin. Raymond looked at the ground, then back at Earl. You really going to take them on? All of them? Just Caleb for now, Earl said. He's got the eye. The other two, they need to want it first. Really want it. Not just feel bad about yesterday. That's guilt. Guilt runs out. I need someone who'll show up on a Saturday because their hands itch to hold a file. He climbed into the truck and turned the key. The engine caught on the first try. The one reliable thing about the old Ford, Earl always said, given was that it started like it had somewhere to be. Earl, Raymond said, leaning on the doorframe, thank you for what you did in there, for what you're going to do. Earl looked at him through the open window. I'm not doing anything noble, Raymond. I'm doing the only thing I know how to do. A man spends his whole life learning something, and if he lets it die with him, then what was the point? He put the truck in reverse. Come by the shop sometime. Bring that scraper I gave you. I want to see if you've been taking care of it. It's in a glass case, Raymond said. Well, take it out, Earl said. Tools aren't decorations, they're promises. He pulled out of the parking lot and turned south, the rifle case riding safe in the bed, the late October light running gold along the flanks of the mountains ahead of him. In his rearview mirror, the sign for Ridgeline Firearms grew smaller, then disappeared behind a curve. Caleb Rowe drove to Harlan County the following Saturday. He arrived at Earl's workshop at 8 a.m, carrying a plastic toolbox he'd bought at a hardware store. Earl looked at the toolbox, looked at Caleb and said, We'll fix that. By the end of the first day, Caleb had learned how to hold a file, how to read grain and how to listen to metal. By the end of the first month, he had his own leather tool roll, hand-stitched by Earl, each pocket sized to a specific tool, the leather cut from a hide Earl had been saving for 11 years because the grain was right. By the end of the first year, Caleb Rowe could draw file a barrel octagon. Not well, not yet. But the motion was in his hands, and the patience was in his bones. And when he stood at the bench beside Earl Hadley, the two of them worked in a silence that was not empty but full of the particular unspoken language that passes between a teacher and a student when the teaching is real. Tyler Briggs changed too, though more slowly. He took down the Instagram account. He started reading. Old gunsmithing manuals, books on metallurgy, accounts of the craft written by men who had practiced it before computers existed. He visited Earl's workshop twice, sat in the corner and watched without speaking. The second time Earl handed him a piece of walnut and a draw knife and said, Make me a handle. Tyler's first attempt was crooked. His second was passable. His third was good. Earl kept the third one. He put it on the pegboard wall next to his own tools without comment. And Tyler understood that this was the highest compliment the old man would ever give. The silent declaration that something you'd made was worthy of the workshop. Marcus Doane came around in his own way, which was louder and less graceful but no less sincere. He stopped narrating his work for the camera and started paying attention to the work itself. he drove to Nashville and spent a weekend at Raymond's shop, not as a visitor, but as a student, standing in the corner the same way Raymond had once stood in Earl's. Raymond gave him the worst job in the shop, hand-sanding stock blanks for 8 hours, and Marcus did it without complaining, and at the end of the day his hands were raw and his back ached, and he understood for the first time that the distance between a craftsman and a technician is measured not in skill, but in willingness to suffer for the quality of the work. The story of what happened at Ridgeline Firearms spread the way such stories do in tight communities, not through headlines or social media posts, but through conversations at gun shows, in workshop break rooms, over workbenches where men and women who cared about the craft leaned close and said, "Did you hear about Earl Hadley and the kids at that shop in Lexington?" It became one of those stories that people tell, not for entertainment, but for instruction, a parable about the cost of arrogance and the quiet, enduring power of mastery. Earl Hadley continued to work. Every morning he walked across the yard to his workshop, opened the steel door, and stood for a moment in the smell of oil and walnut and iron, the smell of his father's life and his grandfather's life, and now, slowly, the life of a young man named Caleb Rowe, who drove down from Lexington every Saturday and was learning, one stroke of the file at a time, what it means to shape something with your hands that will outlast you. The copper weather vane on the roof still pointed into the wind, the pegboard walls still held their tools, and in the corner of the workshop, next to Earl's bench, a second bench had appeared, smaller, newer, with its own pegboard, its own lamp, its own leather tool roll hanging from a brass hook. Sometimes, on those Saturday mornings, the two of them worked without speaking for hours. The only sounds, the whisper of files and the occasional clink of a tool, returned to its place. And if you stood outside the workshop and listened, really listened, you could hear it. Not just the work, the continuation, the sound of something being passed from one set of hands to another, the way it had been passed for 100 years, the way it would be passed for 100 more, as long as someone had the humility to learn and the patience to teach, and the wisdom to know that the most valuable things in this world are never the things that look impressive from the outside. They're the things that only reveal themselves to those who come close enough to listen. If this story reminded you that real mastery is quiet, that respect is earned with your hands, and that the best things we can leave behind aren't objects but knowledge, then subscribe to this channel. We tell stories like this every week. They are stories about people who carried something extraordinary inside them and waited for the right moment, or the right person, to share it. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and if you know a craftsman, a teacher, or anyone who has ever been underestimated, share this with them, because everyone deserves to be seen for what they really are.